On the morning of January 17th, 1781, a British officer named Banastre Tarleton led his column of soldiers at a brisk, confident pace toward a modest cattle grazing field in the backcountry of South Carolina. At his back marched more than 1,000 of the most rigorously drilled, best-equipped soldiers the British Army had to offer, veterans of European campaigns, men who had trained their entire adult lives for exactly this kind of engagement. Standing against them was a battered, exhausted American force that looked, on paper, like no real threat at all. Roughly half of Morgan's men were civilian volunteers, part-time soldiers with farming calluses on their hands and a well-documented reputation for fleeing the battlefield the instant British bayonets came out. Tarleton had seen this story play out before. He had seen American militia crumble under pressure at Camden. He had watched Patriot lines dissolve into panicking individuals the moment disciplined British steel advanced on them. He had ridden across the Carolinas like a force of nature, and almost nothing had stopped him. This engagement, he assumed, would be no different. A quick, hard strike, the Americans would scatter, and by midday his force would be marching back to rejoin Cornwallis with another victory to report. What Tarleton rode into at the Cowpens that frozen January morning was something he had never encountered and was entirely unprepared for. One of the most flawlessly conceived and precisely executed tactical traps in the recorded history of warfare. Within 60 minutes, a single hour, his elite force would be shattered beyond recovery. The man who designed the trap, a frontier general who had never attended a military academy or read a treatise on classical tactics, would deliver a masterclass in battlefield command so complete, so elegant, and so devastating that officers still study it at West Point more than 2 centuries later. The question that deserves a serious answer is this: how did a collection of farmers, shopkeepers, and backcountry riflemen manage to dismantle a professional British army in under an hour? The Southern War nears collapse. To understand Cowpens, you have to understand just how desperate the American situation was in the months leading up to it. South Carolina in late 1780 was not simply difficult territory for the Patriot cause. It was a catastrophe unfolding in slow motion. The British had seized Charleston that May in a siege that ended with more than 5,000 Continental soldiers marched into captivity. It was the single most devastating American military defeat of the entire Revolutionary War, and its effects rippled outward in every direction. With Charleston gone, the British held the most important port city in the South. Lord Cornwallis, commanding British forces in the region, pressed his advantage aggressively. His forces swept through the Carolinas with a confidence bordering on contempt, and loyalist militias, Americans who had sided with the Crown, were terrorizing Patriot families across the countryside, burning homesteads, seizing livestock, and making life genuinely dangerous for anyone who had declared for independence. The remnants of the American Southern Army were scattered, hungry, and demoralized. By most honest assessments, the American Revolution was not merely struggling in the South, it was on the verge of complete collapse. If the South fell permanently into British hands, the political and military consequences for the independence movement would have been severe, possibly fatal. It was into this dire situation that General George Washington dispatched Nathaniel Greene to take command. Greene was among the ablest commanders in the Continental Army, methodical, intelligent, and gifted at logistics. But even Greene, when he arrived and surveyed what remained of the Southern forces, must have felt the weight of the task before him. He found roughly 1,400 half-starved, poorly supplied regulars spread thinly across the Carolina backcountry. They were short on ammunition, short on food, short on shoes, and short on any reason to feel optimistic about their situation. Greene's response to this crisis was a decision that struck most of his officers as borderline madness. He split his already dangerously small force in two. He kept the bulk of his command to occupy Cornwallis and preserve flexibility in the east, while sending approximately 600 men westward, under a general whose temperament, background, and military instincts were entirely unlike his own, Brigadier General Daniel Morgan.
Daniel Morgan's hard-won experience was not the kind of general the 18th century usually produced, and understanding who he was and where he came from is essential to understanding everything that happened at the Cowpens. He had no wealthy family, no aristocratic connections, no formal military education of any kind. He had not studied the campaigns of Frederick the Great or read Vegetius on the art of war. He had grown up poor in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley, working as a teamster, hauling cargo through the wilderness on wagons, a rough and physical occupation that brought him into contact with the land, with ordinary men, and with the grinding reality of hard physical labor. He was not a man of drawing rooms or officers' messes. He was a man of campfires and dirt roads. During the French and Indian War, a conflict that gave many Revolutionary War officers their first taste of fighting, Morgan had an encounter with British military authority that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. He struck a British officer, struck a superior in the rigid hierarchy of the 18th century army, an act that carried severe consequences. He received 500 lashes, a punishment so brutal that lesser men did not survive it. The scars remained on his back until the day he died, a permanent physical record of what the British Army had done to him. Morgan reportedly joked that the British still owed him one lash since the drummer lost count somewhere in the middle. It was the kind of dark humor that men develop when they need to maintain their dignity in the face of something genuinely terrible. A man who has been treated that way does not forget it. He does not forgive it. And when the chance came to fight back, Morgan took it with both hands. When the Revolution broke out, he arrived with a company of Virginia riflemen and threw himself into the war with a ferocity that his men recognized and respected. He fought in nearly every significant engagement of the northern campaigns. At the Siege of Quebec in the brutal winter of 1775, he took a musket ball through the neck, not a graze, not a minor wound, but a hit that should have ended his ability to fight, and kept going. At Saratoga in 1777, his sharpshooters played a decisive role in breaking Burgoyne's army, picking off British officers and NCOs from the tree line with a precision that British commanders found maddening and demoralizing in equal measure. By 1780, Morgan had accumulated something more valuable than any formal military training, a deep, first-hand, hard-earned understanding of how ordinary men actually behaved in combat. Not how they were supposed to behave according to the drill manuals, not how they behaved in theory, how they actually, genuinely behaved when bullets were flying and bayonets were coming toward them and everything inside them was screaming to run. Morgan understood militia. This understanding, clear-eyed, unsentimental, honest about human nature, became the foundation upon which the entire Battle of Cowpens was constructed. Morgan had fought alongside militia units at Saratoga. He had watched them perform brilliantly in the right circumstances, firing from cover, harassing exposed formations, picking off targets at range. He had also watched them at Camden, where a British bayonet charge sent more than 2,000 American militiamen streaming off the battlefield within minutes, abandoning artillery, abandoning their continental comrades, abandoning the field in a panic so complete that it became one of the most embarrassing episodes of the entire war. Most Continental officers drew one conclusion from experiences like Camden: militia were unreliable, possibly useless, a liability to be managed rather than a resource to be deployed. They wished, often bitterly, that they had more trained regulars and fewer civilian volunteers. Morgan drew a completely different conclusion, and the difference between his conclusion and everyone else's was the difference between defeat and one of the most lopsided victories in American military history. Morgan understood that militia were not cowards, they were not weak, they were not inferior human beings who lacked the courage that regular soldiers possessed. They were untrained civilians holding muskets, and asking them to stand in an open field and trade volleys with British regulars who had spent years learning to do exactly that
was not a test of courage, it was a mismatch of preparation. It was like asking a high school football team to hold the defensive line against an NFL offensive front. The high school players are not cowards when they fail to hold that line. They simply have not had the training and experience that the professionals have. Expecting otherwise is not brave or inspiring, it is a failure of command judgment. Morgan accepted this reality completely and without reservation. His militia could fire accurately. They could take covered positions and harass an enemy. They could hit specific targets at range. What they could not reliably do was stand their ground under a massed bayonet charge from British infantry. So Morgan built a plan that required them to do exactly the things they were capable of, and never asked them to do the things they were not. That honest assessment, that willingness to see his men as they actually were rather than as he might have wished them to be, was the seed from which the entire Cowpens plan grew. Choosing Cowpens and building the trap. When Morgan received word that Tarleton was bearing down on him with a fast-moving column of more than 1,000 British regulars, dragoons, and loyalist infantry, he had a genuine choice to make. He could withdraw, push hard to link back up with Green, and avoid an engagement that on paper looked extremely unfavorable. That would have been the cautious choice, the defensible choice, the choice that most commanders in his position would have made without a second thought. Instead, Morgan stopped at a place called the Cowpens, a well-known cattle grazing ground in the rolling hills of northern South Carolina, familiar to locals as a place where livestock were traded and driven. And when his officers saw the ground, they were alarmed. The position looked, by every conventional military standard, terrible. A broad river sat roughly 5 miles behind them, cutting off any meaningful route of retreat. Open terrain extended in all directions, offering no natural defensive features, no dense forest for cover, no swampy ground to slow a cavalry charge, no elevation worth defending. It was exactly the kind of open ground on which British regular infantry and cavalry were at their most dangerous. Morgan had chosen it on purpose. Every apparent weakness was a feature, not a flaw. He did not want his militia to have an exit. He had watched enough militia in enough engagements to know a fundamental truth about human psychology under extreme stress. If the option to run exists, the temptation to take it becomes almost irresistible when 1,000 British soldiers are sprinting toward you with bayonets leveled and battle cries in their throats. By placing a river at the backs of his men, Morgan removed the option entirely. The choice was reduced to its simplest possible form: fight or drown. But, and this is the crucial point, Morgan was not asking his militia to do anything suicidal. He was not asking them to be heroes in any dramatic, theatrical sense. He was asking them to do something very specific, very limited, and very temporary. And then he did something that was, for an 18th century general, almost revolutionary in its directness and its humanity. He spent the entire night before the battle walking the camp. He moved from campfire to campfire in the cold darkness, crouching down beside groups of shivering, nervous men, and he talked to them. He told jokes. He shared stories from Saratoga, talking about times when the British had been beaten by men very much like the ones huddled around these fires. He asked about their families, their farms, their home counties, and in between all of that, in the most matter-of-fact and reassuring voice he could manage, he explained exactly what he needed from each man, each unit, each line.
He told the militia they would not be asked to face a bayonet charge. He told them they only needed to give him 2 good volleys, and then they could withdraw with full honor. Their job would be done, they would have contributed, and no one would think less of them for following the plan. He told the Continental regulars they were the wall that nothing would penetrate. He told Washington's dragoons that the decisive, finishing blow would be theirs to deliver. By the time dawn came, every single man on that field, militiaman, regular, cavalryman, knew precisely what he was supposed to do and precisely when he was supposed to do it. That level of personal engagement, of direct communication between a general and his soldiers on the eve of battle,
was almost without precedent in the military culture of the 18th century. It reflected something deeper than tactical cleverness. It reflected a genuine understanding of men.
Morgan's three-line battle plan. Seen from above, the Cowpens battlefield was roughly 1,000 yards of gently rising open pasture, climbing toward two low, rounded ridges. Morgan arranged his forces in three deliberate, carefully considered lines, each positioned approximately 150 yards behind the one in front of it. The first line was the thinnest and most forward, approximately 150 hand-picked riflemen from Georgia and the Carolinas. These were not typical militia volunteers with limited shooting experience. These were frontier marksmen, men who had grown up hunting in the deep woods, men for whom a shot at 200 or 250 yards with a long rifle was not a feat, but a routine task. Morgan positioned them at the very front of the field with a single, crystal-clear instruction: target the officers. When the British begin their advance, aim for the epaulets. Shoot the men on horseback. Shoot anyone who appears to be giving orders or directing movement. Then, fall back to the second line in good order. The second line was where the heart of Morgan's genius was most visible. This was the main militia body, roughly 300 men from the Carolinas under the command of Andrew Pickens, a steady, respected militia leader. Morgan's instructions to them were radical in their simplicity and their honesty. He did not ask them to hold their ground against the British charge. He did not inspire them with speeches about dying gloriously for liberty. He asked them to fire 2 aimed volleys when the British closed to within 50 yards, and then to turn left, march around the back of the third line, and reform in the rear. 2 shots, then leave. He said it to their faces, directly and without embarrassment. Just give me 2 good fires, boys, and then you can fall back. He acknowledged openly what every man in that line already knew in his gut, that he was not going to ask them to do something they were not capable of doing. He was going to ask them to do something they absolutely could do, and it was going to matter enormously. The third line was the backbone of the entire position. Approximately 450 Continental Regulars and experienced Virginia militia under Lieutenant Colonel John Eager Howard took position on the nearer of the 2 ridges. Trained, disciplined men who had practiced the mechanics of standing in a firing line and exchanging volleys with enemy infantry until it was second nature. These were the soldiers who could absorb the shock of a British advance and hit back hard. They were the anvil on which the battle would be decided. And hidden from view behind the second ridge, completely invisible to any approaching force, sat the element that would transform a successful defense into total destruction. Lieutenant Colonel William Washington, a cousin of the commander-in-chief, waited with roughly 80 Continental Dragoons and 45 mounted militia cavalry. They were the hammer that no one would see coming until it was far too late to do anything about it.
Tarleton charges into the trap. Banastre Tarleton was 26 years old. He was aggressive, instinctive, and almost physically incapable of caution. In the Carolinas, his name had become synonymous with relentless pursuit and sudden, devastating violence. At the Battle of Waxhaws the previous year, his dragoons had cut down American soldiers who were attempting to surrender, men with their hands raised, weapons lowered, and the name Bloody Tarleton had spread through patriot communities across the South like a cold fire. He had been hunting Morgan for days, pushing his men through the frozen backcountry at a pace that was punishing even for soldiers accustomed to hard campaigning. On the night of January 16th, he got his troops out of their bedrolls at 2 in the morning and pushed them forward through pitch darkness, crossing swollen creeks and stumbling through frozen mud for nearly 8 miles before dawn. By the time his force approached the Cowpens, his men were exhausted in the particular bone-deep way that comes from days of sustained exertion without adequate food or sleep. Horses stumbled, infantry dragged their feet. The edge that professional soldiers counted on, the physical and mental sharpness that made them effective, had been dulled by days of brutal marching.
None of this made Tarleton cautious. When his scouts reported that Morgan's force was deployed on open ground with a river at their backs,
Tarleton saw exactly what Morgan had intended him to see: a trapped, outnumbered American force with no way out and nowhere to run. He had cornered them at last. This was the moment he had been chasing across the Carolinas for days. He ordered an immediate attack. No rest for his exhausted men, no meaningful reconnaissance to determine how Morgan's forces were actually deployed or what might be waiting behind those low ridges. No substantial reserve held back in case something went wrong. He formed his infantry into a broad assault line and sent them forward across the frozen pasture at first light, drums beating and confidence high. The first volleys break the British advance. The opening of the battle proceeded exactly as Morgan had scripted it. The British advance first encountered the skirmish line of frontier riflemen. Shots rang out at long range, longer range than British muskets could effectively answer, and British officers began falling from their horses. A captain dropped, then a sergeant. The riflemen fired with the unhurried precision of men who had been making shots like this since childhood, reloaded with practiced hands, fired again, and then melted back toward the second line in good order, just as Morgan had directed. The British pushed on. Ahead of them they could see the main militia line, a thin formation of rough-looking men in civilian clothes, not the neat ranks of Continental regulars, but the ragged, informal assembly of backcountry volunteers. This was the site that British regulars had been trained to charge without hesitation. The drums beat the advance. The redcoats leveled their bayonets, gave a battle shout, and surged forward. At 50 yards, Andrew Pickens gave the order. 300 muskets discharged into the British ranks simultaneously at close range, and the effect was catastrophic. Entire sections of the British line simply ceased to exist as organized units. Men fell in clusters. The smoke from 300 simultaneous discharges rolled across the field in a dense gray curtain. Before that curtain had even begun to thin, the militia reloaded with shaking hands and fired a second, equally devastating volley into the staggering, smoke-shrouded British formation. Then, exactly as Morgan had spent the previous night explaining, the militia turned. They began moving to the left, not fleeing in panic, not scattering as individuals, but moving together as a unit, following the path Morgan had walked them through personally, heading around the back of the Continental line to reform at the rear. Some of them jogged, some walked with deliberate steadiness. A few glanced back over their shoulders at the screaming redcoats behind them, but they held together and they followed the plan. They had done their job. 2 good fires, time to leave the stage. The double envelopment closes. This was the moment Tarleton made the fatal mistake that Morgan had been counting on from the very beginning of his planning. When the British officers saw the militia turning and moving away, they did not interpret it as a planned withdrawal. They saw a rout. The Americans were running. The line had broken. This was Camden happening all over again. The familiar and deeply satisfying sight of American militia crumbling under British pressure. Officers shouted for the pursuit. The adrenaline of apparent victory surged through already excited British ranks, and the disciplined advance that Tarleton had ordered dissolved in an instant into something much less controlled. A full-speed charge, soldiers sprinting uphill, regimental cohesion abandoned in the excitement of what they believed was certain victory. Officers lost control of their formations. Soldiers were no longer advancing in orderly lines. They were running, screaming, bayonets forward, racing to finish off a beaten enemy. They crested the low ridge, still running, still screaming, and ran directly into John Eager Howard's Continental line. Fresh troops, rested soldiers, men standing shoulder to shoulder in a disciplined formation with muskets loaded, leveled, and aimed at the disorganized mob pouring over the ridge toward them.
Howard waited. He let the British come. 40 yards, 30 yards. At nearly point-blank range, when missing was almost impossible and every shot would count, he gave the order to fire. The volley struck the disorganized British charge like a physical wall. Dozens of men fell in an instant. Before the survivors, stunned, shaken, with no momentum left and no understanding of what had just happened, could regroup or respond, Howard ordered a bayonet charge. American regulars crashed forward into the scattered, reeling British front at close quarters, and for the first time in the entire engagement, the British began to give ground. At that precise moment, William Washington's cavalry erupted from behind the second ridge. 80 dragoons at full gallop, sabers drawn, driving hard into the exposed right flank of a British formation that was already staggering from the frontal assault. The sound of cavalry at full charge, the thunder of hooves, the screaming of horses, the flash of blades, hit the British right like a physical blow. And then came the final, decisive piece. Pickens had marched his militia around the back of the Continental line exactly as planned, exactly as Morgan had walked them through the night before. Now they reappeared on the opposite side of the battlefield, reformed into a rough but functional firing line, advancing with loaded muskets on what was now the British left flank.
The geometry of destruction was complete. Howard's bayonets pressing from the front, Washington's cavalry driving in from the right, Pickens's reformed militia closing from the left. A full double envelopment, the same maneuver that Hannibal had used to annihilate a Roman army at Cannae more than 2,000 years earlier, executed on a Carolina cattle pasture by farmers, tradesmen, and backcountry riflemen against one of the most professional armies on Earth. British soldiers who had been sprinting forward in triumph 60 seconds earlier now found themselves surrounded on three sides, with nowhere to go and no coherent command structure left to tell them what to do. The army broke, not gradually, not in stages, it shattered. Muskets hit the ground, hands went up. Officers tried to rally isolated knots of resistance and were cut down or encircled within minutes. Some British regulars fought desperately back to back until they were simply overwhelmed. Others dropped to their knees where they stood.
Tarleton himself attempted a cavalry countercharge with the small reserve he had held back, but Washington's dragoons met him head-on in a swirling melee of sabers and pistol fire. The two officers reportedly clashed personally on horseback, Washington taking a wound in the exchange, before Tarleton broke free and fled the field at full gallop with a handful of surviving riders, leaving the wreckage of his command behind him.
The crushing victory at Cowpens and why it changed the war. The battle lasted approximately 1 hour. In that hour, Morgan's force killed or wounded over 300 British soldiers and captured nearly 600 more, including entire artillery crews and their cannons, which became prizes of war. Tarleton lost more than 80% of his entire command. American losses were 12 killed and 60 wounded. The numbers are so lopsided that military historians have double-checked them repeatedly because they barely seem possible. But they are accurate. Morgan had not simply won a battle, he had annihilated an elite British fighting force at a cost that was, by the brutal mathematics of 18th century warfare, almost nothing. The strategic consequences unfolded rapidly. Cornwallis lost a quarter of his light infantry and his most aggressive field commander in a single morning. The material losses were severe. The psychological damage may have been worse. British officers across the Southern Theater had built their entire operational approach on a foundation that Cowpens had now cracked beyond repair, the assumption that American militia would always crack under pressure. Morgan had demonstrated with brutal clarity that this assumption was wrong, and the implications of that demonstration spread through every British garrison from Savannah to Wilmington.
Cornwallis responded with a decision born of fury rather than strategy. He burned his own supply wagons, an extraordinary and drastic act, in order to lighten his army enough to pursue Greene's force northward into Virginia. That pursuit stretched his supply lines to the point of breaking, exhausted his remaining troops, and dragged him further and further from his bases of support in the south. It was a chase driven by wounded pride and frustration, not by military logic. And it carried him, step by step, toward a small tobacco port on the Chesapeake Bay called Yorktown, where a combined American and French force surrounded him that October, and the British Army in America effectively ceased to be a war-winning instrument. The road to Yorktown ran through Cowpens. What makes the battle genuinely remarkable, what elevates it beyond a successful ambush or a lucky engagement, is the completeness of its design and the honesty of its foundation. Morgan did not win because he was luckier than Tarleton, or because his men fought with greater courage, or because the terrain happened to favor him. He won because he understood his own army with a clarity that was rare in any era of military history. He did not wish his militia were something they were not. He did not try to force them into a mold they could not fit. He looked at them honestly, accepted them completely, and built a battle plan that turned their genuine capabilities and their predictable limitations into the architecture of a perfect trap. The militia's retreat was not a weakness he had to compensate for. It was the mechanism that made everything else work. It was the bait that drew Tarleton's men out of formation and into the killing ground. The retreat was not a flaw in the plan. The retreat was the plan. Militaries around the world still teach Cowpens as a case study in double envelopment, in force employment, in the importance of knowing your own soldiers, and in using an enemy's aggression against him. The comparison to Cannae is made often, and it is fair as far as it goes, but Hannibal commanded veteran warriors who had trained together for years. Morgan accomplished the same result with militia who had been planting corn 6 weeks earlier on a cattle pasture in the Carolina backcountry, against an opponent who, by any reasonable standard, should have known better. The ground at Cowpens is quiet now. A national battlefield park occupies the site, with markers showing where each line stood, where each volley was fired, where Washington's cavalry launched their decisive charge. The rolling pasture looks much as it did in January of 1781. Green grass, gentle hills, open Carolina sky. Standing there today, it requires a genuine effort of imagination to comprehend that for 1 hour on a freezing morning more than 2 centuries ago, this modest patch of ground hosted one of the most complete, elegant, and lopsided victories in the history of American arms.